just real quick before I start, in addition to what Wendy said, you don't care so much about seedlings, but the problem we have with seedlings with day neutrals, if you plant them in the spring and you select in the fall, a lot of those things that you select in August, September, never day neutral, or never day neutral again. They behave very differently in their seedling year. So we think it's, and other people have shown it's very important to have those seedlings go through a normal dormant period and then evaluate them the following year. So you're never going to be growing seedlings, but if you were, that's a big deal. Okay, oh, that's great. So we'll take a trip through what we've been up to. We're going to start off with a little bit more sciencey stuff, and then switch over to our selections, or to our breeding. Page down. There we go. Enter. Okay. Oh, I got all the way to the end. Slide 23. Back slide. I'm moving the mouse too fast.
Yeah.
17.
Chad broke it for usual.
That's, yeah, there we go.
What if you just maybe try the left?
I don't know, it should be easier.
Or up or down?
Move this up or down. Okay, so we're going to talk about, first a little bit about some work that a student just finished up last week, or just defended on last week, related to sort of genetics in day neutrals. And then we'll talk about our breeding effort. Okay. First of all, some of this is just real review. I'm just going to have one quick slide, but you know, the reason we have this difference between sort of the June bearing or short day types and the day neutral, or whatever you want to call them, lots of different names, is because how strawberries respond to day length. And we have sort of the two different types. I mean, we've got a lot of different names for them, whether it's June bearer, short day, single flowering, one's flowering. That's hood, totem, tillum, we'll call those. And then we have, you know, the day neutral types, or remontant, or now the new term, thanks to French breeding programs, is perpetual flowering. Because that's sort of more accurate, because they just keep flowering as opposed to day neutrals, which really isn't scientifically accurate, even though we've sort of gotten used to that term. So we have those two broad types, but it's a reaction between whether the days are shortening or lengthening and temperature. The remontant types, perpetual flowering types, tend not to respond to the day length, but they do respond, and so they keep flowering, but they do respond to temperature. So another interesting thing in these types is, you know, when we're getting above 90 degrees, a lot of times flowering shuts down. The flowers abort before they're open. And so you sometimes get gaps or cyclical production in response to temperature. And so that's one of the things we'd like to overcome, especially we work a lot with folks in the Midwest, and you know, some of the day neutral varieties they'll grow there just completely shut down for 6 weeks before they start coming back on. It's all because the flowers have all aborted, or have aborted before they've even had a chance to open. So we'd like to get over that. So one of the things we've worked on with other people is trying to develop genetic markers for perpetual flowering or day neutrality. And there's a group out of Michigan State that Travis back there in the corner worked with. He probably cleaned up some of the plants that Sonali used. But we found markers associated, and these are genetic markers in genetic stuff that you never see that predict repeat flowering or remontancy. There's a group a French group that this is where the perpetual flowering characteristic came from. They found this genetic marker associated with repeat flowering. Down, you know, they've got markers. So when we talk about genetic markers, it's something we can analyze in the lab. And so we may think that the perpetual flowering gene is in one spot, and we find genetic markers that are associated nearby with that spot. So we can go through and put these plants through a machine and come back and they'll say, yes, it's got that PFRU. Well, it'll actually say it's got the marker that's near that PFRU. And so hopefully that helps us identify ones that are repeat flowering. And so, you know, we've gone through, and there's a number of different sources of repeat flowering. There's what we've gotten out of the California material, and also the Beltsville material, the tribute. And that's called the Wasatch source. And basically, Royce Bringhurst, who was a breeder in California, used to summer every year up in the Wasatch Mountains above Salt Lake City. And he'd go out hiking and he found some strawberries there that he brought back and he incorporated into his breeding program at UC Davis. Turns out, because those were way up high in the mountains, they had a very short growing season, flowering season, fruiting season. And so they had to get up and do things quick. Regardless of day length or temperature, they just had to go. And that trait incorporated in is what gave us most of our repeat flowering material. But there's also old ones. Fort Laramie is an old variety out of Wyoming. And so sort of probably the same sort of thing. Somebody used some wild germplasm that was very adapted to a really long winter, a really short growing season. And so that's called the Pan American source. And then there's a newer one that any of you who might get Johnny's Selected Seed Catalog or something, or there's some other ones. There's seed sources of day neutrality, of strawberries that have day neutral traits. We're not exactly sure where they got that trait from. But we do know that the seeds we grow out from those generate plants that just flower and fruit like crazy. And we call it the Syrian source. We really don't know where it came from. But so we have these different sources, and now we're starting to get different markers to identify the repeat flowering. We then assembled all this material from Europe and the US. We planted it out in Corvallis, and over a series of years we evaluated it for for flowering time. We did a lot of different traits, but one of the things we did was flowering. And so we did the phenotyping, which means looking at it and saying it flowered on this day, and it flowered on this day, and it flowered on this day. But then we also are doing the genetic work and the genotyping work to help us identify genetic markers associated with that trait. We looked at several different populations from Europe. We looked at about, close to 40 populations from Michigan and Oregon. And that was all the phenotyping. Then we sort of divided up, when you start looking at perpetual flowering or day neutrality, that it bloom in the spring, that led to a June bearing crop, that also bloom. We chose the artificial date of middle of July, which is about a month after the shortest day of the year. And did it flower after that? Was it flowering at that point or after? So we assumed that it had initiated flowers when the days were really long. And so we sort of used that as a dividing, and were able to score the plants that way. Then they went to work in the lab, and they developed SSR primers, and they used this cool technique that allowed, this is not my work, this is a grad student who's working with Nalabacille. But they get these things that, they can tell you which gene, whether you have the markers for that day neutrality trait. And so what they found is that they could get a pretty good association, and depending on which source, about 80% to 100%, well, 80 to 90%, 70% association, meaning if they ran tissue through for a certain marker, they could predict with 83% of the time whether it was going to be day neutral or not. They could predict 70% of the time whether it was day neutral or not. So hopefully you guys start to figure out where this might help the breeding program. So, we have 10 populations. That's these on the left, they're going to go into the ground in a week. They've sampled every single one of those plants. They've run the leaves, they're going to tell us soon, hopefully before we plant, which ones of those plants are day neutral or not. Now we're going to plant all of them this year, but as a breeding program, if we could dump all the ones except for the ones with arrows on them, and only plant the ones with arrows on them that say they're going to be day neutral, that would speed up our progress. And so that's the whole idea behind it, because we have such a problem identifying the ones that are really good at repeat flowering. Can we use this tool to eliminate half of the seedlings and only plant the ones we have a pretty good idea they're going to repeat flower, they're going to be day neutral. So that's the work that Natalia Salinas did and just finished up her master's on. And we think it's going to work. It's just a matter of, it's always hard when you go from these genetic markers where they're doing this stuff in the lab to plant breeders. We really hate to throw away half of our seedlings. It's just really hard to do because we don't trust this yet. But this is why we're going to test it. Like I said, this is going to be a great test. They've screened all these. They're going to tell us, hopefully before we plant, but maybe not until after we plant, which ones they predict are going to be day neutral. And then we're going to go out and look at them in the field. If it works, next year we'll only plant the ones with the arrows. So that's sort of the genetic marker development. That's why we're doing all that. And that's why, when we start looking at all this molecular stuff that people talk about, this is the kind of place where it can really help us in breeding. We're just using traditional tools But this kind of technique allows us to identify the genotypes that are the best to plant. Okay, as far as breeding effort, some of this is repeat of what Wendy talked about. Historically, Whitey, who was my predecessor and was the breeder here from 68 to 88, basically. I've been here longer than Whitey. Can you believe that, Matt? More growing seasons. He started his effort, there was a few crosses, but he didn't do all that much in day neutrals. Sort of the first crosses we did back in 1998. The challenges we faced were a lot about what Wendy's figured out faster than we figured out. You're trying to select for day neutral types when you're thinking about what you do as a June bearing system. And so it's a matter of trying to treat these day neutrals as a completely different crop. Growing them to be bigger plants, planting them at different times a year, putting them on plastic, they just don't really work very well without being grown on plastic, at least in our management system. We also have problems with diseases. Without plastic, we just get eaten up with anthracnose through the season, partly because of the genetics we've probably selected for, but partly just because of soil splash. We do it, as Wendy talked about fruit malformations. We have those issues. Then we also have the issue of propagation. We have to make sure we select for things that do runner, because sometimes you find these really cool things that are fantastic, but if the nursery can't get them to runner, you're really stuck. And so trying to learn what that balance is. We do have the issue also making sure that nurseries will even propagate them. So we've fixed this by getting everything. Our seedlings are now going on plastic as far as this year. We've been using an evaluation system at North Willamette we've had on plastic now. Try to select the balance, and then we just hope the commercial nurseries will propagate day neutrals if we develop those. As far as progress, first of all, some of the parents we've used over the last, I sort of went through the records and found all the different sources of day neutrality we've used, and the first year you use them. So while all this work was mostly done the last few years, there's a few things on there like Fort Laramie that there was a cross in 72. But most of this was in 2000s. Those first two were out of the Alaskan Canyon breeding program. They had shared with us a number of materials from the UK or UC Davis program, a little bit from Michigan State. We've also tried to use Julie Marie Dubois, but it's a horrible parent too. And then a lot of different things that we've tried to use and incorporate into the program. My time up? Oh, okay. I'll show sort of the results from this past summer that Patrick Jones put together. That this is just through early July, so this is for this year is actually starting to get into the big second part of the season. But we have replicated trials and observation plots. That means one plot or multiple plots. So the good news is that we're starting to get things that we haven't done the statistical analysis. These may not be statistically different. I would not be surprised at all if Albion was not. It may be the same as 3175-2 by the end of the season, and with statistics, it may not be statistically different, but at least it's nice to have some things that are higher yielding than Albion. There's some things that are larger than Albion, not huge. We'd like to see our size up. We know commercial growers can do a better job on this than we can. Down in the observation plots, we had some things, some of the named ones, Seascape and San Andreas, were the best performers, but that's in a single plot. It's always hard to judge how a single plot compares to a replicated trial. Usually I would guess that some of the best ones in each, the top, are at least as good as the ones on the bottom. If you look at this jumble of lines, we had the first season, part of the season started off in May. We picked up in June, and now Patrick's starting to pick up in, he's been picking fruit all the way through August here. We just have a range of performance. It's not a lot different than what you saw in the previous slide, but we do have some things that had a June crop and never cropped again. I guess I dropped that selection off the graph, but just a range of performance. But a lot of them are pretty similar to what you would expect in a commercial cultivar, even though we'd like to fix them. As far as some of the things, just to see, sort of Wendy looked at this in a trait perspective, and I'll look at this as from a selection perspective. This is our highest yielder. It's productive. It's got lots of fruit. This is one of those things out of Syria that just flowers and fruits like crazy and doesn't seem to stop very much. But the fruit is pretty small. I just don't see how this would ever be commercially viable. We will use that kind of it as a parent. This is probably the one that's most promising, and we're trying to get some plants out of a commercial trial, 3385-1, productive. It's really nice to eat. It's got about Albion size for us, and if we get some plants, we'll put them into grower trials. So certainly let Ted know if you're interested in trialing. We don't expect to have very many plants, but we're going to try to get them out. So this is sort of, all this is new for us, so this is a good one to do a trial run on as far as trying it in the grower trials, seeing where we fail, and whether it actually has some commercial potential. It's certainly a field day this past year. It looked interesting enough to commercial growers. They paused for a few minutes at it, so that's good. We have other ones that came out of a collaborative effort with Michigan State University. Once again, we have a lot of this really productive but too small fruit, and we need to work on improving fruit size, I think, especially over the course of the season. So once again, this is probably apparent only. I like the fact that, as Wendy was talking about, this is about as much vegetative growth as you want. It's starting to grow together, but not the big bush she showed. So this is the kind of thing we would be targeting. With that, I'll stop and let anybody ask any questions. Any questions? Okay. No questions? Nah.
Gonna let him off that easy?
Tom, good question.
I won't let you off. So are you setting up plastic culture for your stuff, or are these U figures coming from regular type plots? Do you have them on plastic?
All in plastic.
All on plastic?
Yes.
Are you expanding number of seedlings, or?
We'll see. We had done a lot of seedlings. We got very frustrated with day neutrals. We had bred them for a number of years, but the problem was we kept putting them into, we were up to probably, one year we might have had 2,000 seedlings out there, which is quite a few. Whereas this year, I think Ted's going to put in 400 or 500. So that way we're going down. If we can see some success, even if it's just a matter of something like this 3385-1, I'd tell you it'd be commercial, but let's be realistic, we're new at this. If it's even interesting after it's gone to commercial trial, people go, what's a good start? Still not going to tear out my album, it's a good start. Then we might be more encouraged and keep moving. So it's hard to say.
And more of a maybe industry type question, but do you feel like you're diluting your resources away from the possibility of June bearers?
Yes.
Yeah, this is the problem.
I know this is the problem. This is why it's also at a small amount, and it's sort of, we still feel like, I guess we were about ready to pull the plug on doing day neutrals, because we weren't doing it right, we couldn't seem to do it right. It was hard to get excited about some of the stuff we had originally, especially because we weren't doing it right. And, this is in the heyday of Albion taking off, and we do have the question of, can we at all compete with somebody who's doing 40,000 seedlings in California? If we come up with something that's pretty cool, but there's an Albion 2, are we wasting our time? Because they will always have an advantage there. Now, if we can, as Wendy really emphasized, the flavor, if we can get a hood that was day neutral, everybody would be happy to plant it if it had some productivity. But we don't have that yet. So I think it's all a big experiment right now, and I guess I don't know the results yet. I also worry, as a discussion point, not to put Elastic Canyon on the spot at all, but how many day neutral plants can they sell in the Northwest? And if they can only sell 500,000 or 1 million or 2 million plants, they sometimes have a hard, not they, meaning Last and Day, the nursery, sometimes have a hard time justifying planting 10 million Totem or Tillamook. Are they going to really be able to be willing to plant 1 million, 3385-1? I don't know.
It's interesting though, because the trend is pushing towards day neutral buying. The plants are being bought up as day neutral. Granted, the majority of them are Albion or, some of the more popular types, but do you think that that trend would encourage some selections to be also similar to what June bearing is right now too.
We also, but it's hard, you really need to dig into statistics a little bit. Because first of all, you have an industry in BC that when you look at the numbers,
That's true, yeah.
they closed all their processing plants. So those guys had no choice. They're done with processing. And so Albion, and they had done enough work on that, they jumped on it. With the day neutrals, while Matt has a 16-year-old Albion field, most of the time, your day neutrals are only in for a year or two. And so compared to 3 or 4 for some varieties of June bearers.
But that's a good thing for the,
It's a good thing for the nursery, but it also means the numbers are elusive a little bit to how to tear them apart.
That's true.
I mean, if you look at Oregon plant sales, it's still predominantly
Yeah.
June bearers. It's still predominantly Totem and Tillamook and Hood. So it's hard.
But there's potential for fresh market.
Yeah, but it's still back to Matt. I mean, and I don't have the answers. You know, if Charlie were here, I'd put him on the spot. But I know these guys are the breeding program, not in the sales office back there. You know, what are the hard realities of how many plants does it take for them to justify?
Is there anyone, someone was from Lassen Canyon was supposed to show up today. Is
Yeah, they're here, but
Oh,
it's the
okay.
breeding program. It's not the
Alright.
sales office. So I don't want to put these guys on the spot.
All right.
I do know that a few years ago, whether it was NorCal or Lassen, they said they had to fight to plant Totem because Totem was a waste of time compared to Albion down in California. I mean, you got 1 billion, well, 500 million plants versus 10 million. Why are we messing with the one that's 10 million? And so I'm not saying, I think they've gone away from that and back to more being willing to do it, but you always have that problem that they just say, shoot, it's not worth producing 1 million plants.
It seems like they've got a variety. I mean, there's a lot of different plants planted in Oregon,
Yeah.
being raised anywhere, some are.
I guess it's not, I'm not, you know, it's just trying to figure out, back to Tom's question. It really gets back to this, how much time can you justify when you have these things that are a little bit squishy on, you know, the nurseries and, you know, the fact that, you know, the day neutral guys generally, many of the fresh market producers do not contribute to the commission, which is where a significant amount of funding comes from. But we also get funding from Northwest Center and hard funding, so you can justify it, it does not need to come from commission necessarily, but it is harder.
All right, well, let's give Chad a hand. Thanks, Chad.